ability.
Okay, so good morning, good evening, wherever you may be joining us from, and welcome to day 3, the final morning session of the Pacific Basin Economic Council Annual Dialogue Summit of 2022. And I'm so delighted to be kicking off this morning's session on governance, which is a theme that is, I think, been coming up through a few of the sessions in day 1 and day 2. We talk about trust in particular is a key issue for building strong relationships, especially cross-border and in times where we've been shut off during COVID. Building that trust through face-to-face engagement is still so important. But having mediums like this through technology that we've all learned, I think, through COVID as well, has enabled us to connect on a different level on a more regular basis over vast distances. And this couldn't be more demonstrated than today, where we're joined from Singapore, Malaysia, California, and obviously here in Hong Kong. So I'm delighted to see everybody up bright and early or in the afternoon in LA and California. So I'm going to now hand over the floor, if I may, to Stacey Choi, Director at Brunswick Group, who will be moderating the session on good corporate governance. So over to you, Stacey, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you, and thank you, Mike. So hello, everyone. Welcome to today's roundtable on corporate governance, as Mike mentioned. Here at the Pacific Basin Economic Council, you've heard about our theme for this year's dialogue on sustainable economic growth in the age of complexity. And throughout the last 2 days of the program, Michael mentioned about trust and the opportunities, but we are very much also in a much more volatile and much more complex environment today, given multiple headwinds and disruptions. That complexity makes delivering sustainable growth a lot more challenging for corporations and governments alike. And the range of issues and the speed and velocity at which they land in a corporate boardroom have also multiplied, making the role of boards ever more challenging. So today we have a panel of experts to talk us through what are some of the key issues that boards are facing today, how boards can better adapt to these fast evolving changes and disruptions, and how can boards equip themselves to build competency and resilience in the midst of evolving challenges that we're seeing. My name is Stacey Chow, and I'm a director and Asia Pacific regional lead for Brunswick Group on Business and Society. Brunswick Group is a strategic advisory firm, and previously I was at the World Economic Forum and the World Bank. And I'm really delighted to be moderating today's panel of experts. We have Adelena Chong. She is a board of director of the Pacific Basin Economic Council and managing partner and co-founder of Paddee Connexions, which focuses on coaching and advisory for board members and business owners. Thank you, Adelena, for joining.
Thank you.
We have Dr. Jeanne, Chief Sustainability Officer at Blue Onion, an ESG modeling and analytics platform. Thank you, Dr. Ng, for joining. And we have Christopher Leahy, co-founder and managing director of Blackpeak, an investigative research and risk advisory firm. He's also the specialist advisor at Asian Corporate Governance Association. Thank you, Chris. And we have Fung, chair of the People-Centered Internet and chair technical committee on sustainability at IEEE Society for the Social Implications of Technology. Thank you, Mei-Ling. And we're so delighted to have this group of advisors and experts on this topic. We welcome you in the audience to join into this dialogue. So if you have any questions, please type them in the question box, and the organizers and I will also raise them throughout the discussion. So let's get straight into one of the big issues that I just talked about. So everyone here, take us through some of the key issues that boards are looking at today. We're talking about how complex it is. So what are some of the big key issues that our audience should know about that boards are facing? Let's start with maybe ESG. It seems to be, on the headlines and top of minds for everyone. Dr. Jeanne, do you want to start?
Sure. Of course, ESG is the hot topic worldwide, globally. And I think, look, the challenge here for ESG is there are threefold. Number one, ESG, 3 little letters, look really, I think, disarmingly simple when actually it's a broad range of issues. So the broadness of what it covers is challenge number one. Challenge number two is the fact that it's new. So this idea of kind of all three of these areas now needing to be addressed by businesses and all organizations, how to integrate, what does it mean for an organization? That type of knowledge, the institutional knowledge of that, is also very short historically. And then thirdly, you combine that with this macro trend. Social media has raised everyone's expectations, has given everyone a lot of, information. So even though you theoretically are not an expert yet, but you feel like after reading, 100 hours on Wiki and Google, you may become an expert, that then everyone seems to have really high expectations of how people perform in ESG. So you've got this kind of clashing of the expectations of the deep knowledge, like, is your piece of data verified? Is it accurate? Is it as accurate as a financial piece of data? And yet the knowledge that is around to be able to do all of this is still developing, right? So I think there's that. And that's why I really feel for the boards, because it's not just the boards, it's, the organizations themselves, management, operational level, everyone is kind of struggling to kind of learn and quickly pick up and how to improve and become experts in these areas so that we can do well.
Yeah, and we'll come back to how can boards do that. But Jeanne, on ESG as a terminology, it also, encompasses quite a lot of areas, right?
It is very broad. Like I'm just going to name like environment, right? Air, waste, water, noise, biodiversity, and it changes and it expands over time, right? So, you even look at ecology and there's, air, land, water. You talk about social, right? Social, it's not just internally your staff or labor, but now because of social media, the external stakeholders have more and more say and more influence on the organization and reputation of any business or organization. So that means it's not just your customers, but now it's also even the general public, which can influence the government that regulates, and therefore, it cascades. And so actually, the social side has become really broad. And I think that really is going to be one of the key upcoming challenges, that environment, at least scientifically, and I'm a science person, I love the fact that I can have numbers and it's very easy to measure and therefore set some targets. But I think the social side is really going to be extremely important. And in fact, that's why I think the G, I always said it should be GES, because the G is so important, because if you don't have the proper governance in a company or organization in the first place, you can't measure, monitor, or decide to do anything on E and S properly, right? So the governance is so critical.
Yeah,
Stacey,
and I know we have an ESG session right after, but I absolutely agree with you that governance and corporate governance is so important. Chris, on to you. Yeah, what do you think?
Can I just sort of react to some of the things that Jeanne just said? I think, first of all, very happy to hear her say that it should be G and then maybe ES afterwards, after a pause. All of this starts with governance. You can't be environmentally and socially compliant if you don't have the right governance on your board. That's clear. I think the other thing is that, it's human nature to put labels on things. So we talk about ESG, some people's eyes glaze over and think that that's just a disclosure issue, it's a transparency issue. But if you try to unpack what we're talking about, when you just talked about some of the risks facing boards, I started to scribble, and in no particular order: supply chain management and supply chain integrity, geopolitical risks, cybersecurity, data privacy, stakeholder capitalism, brand management, climate change. Now, I've missed probably 30, 40, 50 more risks, but you can repack all those into a box with ESG written on the outside. And that's those are the sort of things that we're talking. So it's very easy, I think, for people to say, oh, ESG, that's something that, I have to do to report to my investors. It's actually far, far more complex.
Yeah, and it's material, right? It's also what's material to a sector, to a company. Chris, you mentioned geopolitics, and that is absolutely one of the key issues as well. And, geopolitical risks is definitely in the headlines, given geopolitical tensions, the war in Ukraine, and, even in terms of broader geopolitical tensions between China and the rest of the world. Can you talk us through how geopolitical risk should be seen as a board issue? And how does it impact companies?
Well, I think the immediate obvious is supply chain. So I think the war in Ukraine has awoken everybody to the direct impact of higher oil prices, for example, higher gas prices, and how that affects the supply chain, how it affects raw materials. And that's something that I think has hit home very, very sharply. I think looking a bit further ahead, the Cold War or the second Cold War that appears to be starting between the United States and the People's Republic of China. We can debate whether that's really started, but I would say that it probably has, in terms of trade war and so on, and sanctions. I think is forcing boards to reconsider very carefully their supply chains. There's a lot of talk about the end of globalization. I think that is certainly likely. I'm not sure it's it's a foregone conclusion, but definitely supply chains are going to have to come much closer to home. People are going to look through a geopolitical lens now. Boards are having to, when they source raw materials, when they outsource production. So I think that's top of the agenda, or very close to the top of the agenda, given what's, what appears to be happening in Asia Pacific with the US, and of course in Europe, right immediately because of the conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah, and absolutely, as you mentioned, Chris, that was a very, very clear point that the geopolitical aspects impact trade and supply chain, investment flows, even climate cooperation, right, Jeanne? And then for sure around technology, which is a big piece of that competition. Mei-Lin, do you want to take us through, how does technology as an area impact how boards are looking at these issues? It's quite complex. There are many different areas that you're looking at, right? What do you think?
Yeah, I have a question, which is for everyone. Are you ready for the technology change? I speak as chair of the People-Centered Internet. I'm on the UN Advisory Council for GovStack, Government Digital Building Blocks. And I'm one of the World Summit on the Information Society Gender Trendsetters. And when I say, are you ready? I want to bring up some statistics. What is happening with digital technology and why should boards care? Well, that's because lots of companies are caring and boards should pay attention to this. So why do businesses adopt a digital model? 40% do it to improve operational efficiency, 35% to meet changing customer expectations, and 26% to improve new product quality. So yeah, those are solid reasons. That's why they do it. But here's the rub. Who is holding back companies' digital transformation initiatives? This is from a website called Finances Online. 37% say it's the CEO or the board of directors that are holding back the digital transformation initiatives. 32% say it's the senior executive team, C-suite, other than the CEO. So when we talk about good corporate governance, it's one thing to talk about good corporate governance when you're on a calm sea, but when there's a big wave coming, and this is one of the biggest waves that is affecting all companies and governments' operations, you need to make sure that you're ready. And if you aren't already thinking about digital, be aware that you could be one of the 37% who is holding back the digital transformation initiatives, not helping your company prepare. There's such a big change coming. It could be the biggest change for business ever. Digital allows you to measure immaterial things, all our accounting, all the way businesses have been done, were done using physical units. I was at Oracle in the 90s, and that was the first generally accepted accounting principles, software revenue recognition. Truly, no one understood what huge change that was. And Oracle nearly went bankrupt because it was using the traditional ways of measuring revenue and cash flow. And the traditional measures are not enough for a board to guide a company through this big storm. Back to you, Stacey.
Maylin, that was a very good analogy. We have multiple waves coming. Technology is definitely a huge wave. And the statistics you just cited are really insightful because it shows that the board and C-suite are not particularly ready, and they could be a barrier. But technology also brings along risks, right? Cyber security risks, data privacy, data security. Do you think they're ready for those risks as well? If they're not adopting technology, are they at least aware of the implications of technology?
I think boards may not be getting into technology because of those fears, but they're not realizing that if you don't face up to it, you could be history. So you got to get in and swim. Cybersecurity is a huge issue. Every company, down to the smallest ones, can be attacked. And we certainly know that individuals are being attacked with identity theft. We are in the largest transformation that has ever happened to humanity, the impact of digital. And it's best to get in and learn to swim. Staying on the sidelines, the waves just going to wash you away.
Yeah, and learning how to swim means overcoming that fear, which is quite important. Now, I mean, we're talking about risks, and Chris, I also wanted to get your views and the panelists' views. Besides cybersecurity risk and ESG risks, corporate boards are still very much providing oversight around ethics. And there's still a lot of risks around, we see it in the headlines in terms of fraud and bribery, insider trading, connected transactions, and corporate governance issues. How do you think boards are managing, overseeing all of these waves of issues, along with the quote unquote bread and butter corporate governance issues? How are they balancing that? Because it seems challenging.
Yeah, I think especially given the economic backdrop that we're all heading into, I mean, it looks increasingly likely that the US will enter a recession in the first quarter of next year. We'll see, but it looks like that. That's certainly what the inverted yield curve is suggesting. Europe is arguably following close behind. Britain's already in a recession. And a lot of the rest of the world is likely to follow. So I think that that is going to, is already beginning to reveal, as Warren Buffett said, who's swimming naked and who's not, as the tide recedes. And we've seen some high profile blow-ups of course, in the cryptocurrency world, which is the Web3, where arguably it was the most risk-on sector, but you'll see that all over in economies, all over sectors, because money's been free for the last 15 years, and now it's not. And companies are over-levered, and people have been trying to keep the lights on when they're struggling. And so ethics becomes a real issue. It can be a fine line between trying to make ends meet as a company when things get tight to jumping on the other side, crossing the line and doing something that's fraudulent. So economic history is littered with examples of huge companies, and they're the ones that hit the headlines, that turn out to be frauds when markets adjust. We've got one with the FTX situation. Bernie Madoff followed the global financial crisis. Lehman Brothers went down. We've had WorldCom out of the .com bust, Enron, and the list goes on. Parmalat, Ahold. They're not just Asian stocks, by the way. I'm citing these deliberately, right? They're the United States and Europe, some of these companies. And so I think you're going to, the boards are going to have to manage that issue. But it's too late to do it post facto. I mean, if you're talking about managing ethics, that's something akin to steering a tanker. You know, it takes a long time to turn it around. And governance, you know, proper governance, not the sort of compliance type, real governance starts at the top. And it's a cultural issue. I mean, it requires leadership at the very top, and it has to have the right systems. It has to have the right culture and ethos throughout the organization.
Yeah, and I'll get to culture because now we're getting into the people side of things. And Adelena, I'd like to come to you because you are definitely in the people business and looking at what boards are facing. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, there's the culture piece, and then there's also the other wave, as just riding on Mei Lin's analogy, the wave of next generation employees that are demanding and expecting very different working environments than previous generations. Are corporate boards and companies ready for that wave? What do you think?
Thank you, Stacey. Yeah, I think that's a very pertinent question at this stage, right? And what, you know, Chris, Jeanne, and also Mei Lin has highlighted is that in the current situation in the marketplace right now, it's a challenge for everyone, right? It's a challenge for employees. It's a challenge for the activists. It's a challenge for politics, governments. It's a challenge definitely for CEOs, boards, customers, suppliers. Everybody is in this together, like it or not, right? And I think the key thing that is probably not really spoken a lot of is the clear fact that there is a huge distrust. Okay, it's a huge distrust, and we are all skirting around it. There's a distrust with the government. There's a distrust with other people, whether it's suppliers, because you're wondering, hey, you know, are you doing the right thing? We can't actually see what you're doing unless we actually audit, you know, your processes, which is what ESG is all about, you know, going down the supply chain. And customers are wondering, hey, you know, as a practice in your organization, purchasing your product or service, are you actually doing the right thing for the environment? Are you doing the right thing by your people? Are you adhering, you know, to the rules and regulations, right? So I think this is something which central to everything that's happening in the world right now. We need to come together and bridge this gap. So what is actually really needed is first and foremost to acknowledge that there is this trust gap. There is an expectation gap to that perspective as well. And all of us want to do the best thing for humanity. That's central, first and foremost. Look, I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. I've been an entrepreneur for the past 25 years. You know, I'm in business not to do something bad, right? And, you know, people who are running public listed companies or they're running SMEs, for example, they're not in the business, you know, to create hell for anybody. Let's just put it this way, right? Because then they're not actually going to make any profits if you talk about it from that standpoint, yeah? And definitely, you know, everyone wants to do well for another human being, whether they're your employees, and most, you know, entrepreneurs actually look from this standpoint as employees as their family, because they are in the trenches every day, you know, moving things forward. So whether you're talking about intergenerational gaps, you know, whether it's the millennials, the Gen Z, or whether it's, you know, the baby boomers, for example, I think it's very much coming together with one clear goal or mission and being very clear about that and embracing that as a family, if you want to put it that way, right? Whether it's better digitalization, you know, we're going to move forward with technology. You know, if there's something that, you know, even baby boomers need to understand, for example, right? why and how do the new technology will help everybody to do better, be faster, get there, in that space and time to achieve the goals that everyone wants. Caring for the society, caring for the environment, and meeting when businesses do well, let's just put it this way, they pay more taxes. This is how, economy works. And when you pay more taxes, the government has got the money to actually do more good for the people of the country. That's the way that it works, right? So this is where we kind of like want to look at things and understanding the perspectives of where we are going with this. And I think what really is perhaps difficult, right, for many people is the fact that there is a lack of communication. There's a lack of engagement with the communication as well, even if there is some, right?
Yeah.
And, I think we need to sort of like take accountability. Each sector, each one of us needs to take accountability for that. We need to bring ourselves forward to communicate more, engage more, be heard, and the other party needs to listen, and hear that out too, right?
Yeah.
That needs to be a listening party on the other end as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So on a certain perspective, I mean, I know there's been so many issues. I mean, I serve on the board of the Malaysian Alliance of Corporate Directors. Yeah. And I also serve on the board of plantation companies, and whether it's palm oil or rubber. And in this perspective, businesses, we're struggling. We're struggling with the facts of really getting things into perspective. And I think everybody also needs to understand that things take time to turn around.
Yeah.
What I think is crucial, I think, for boards right now is to also understand that it's not just about doing what we used to do before and hoping that that's just going to be able to continue it forward the way that, it used to work.
Yeah.
The key thing right now, I think, is a whole mindset shift, right? It's a whole mindset shift, because once we really take into this perspective of, hey, if we make ESG the center and the core of everything that we do, you're actually going to realize that even your business model needs to change.
So as an anchor, thank you, Adelena. That's very helpful. And I was just wondering for the rest of the panel, I mean, we talked about a waves of different issues. Adelena, thank you for bringing up the trust gap. And you've already brought out some of the solutions, potentially, of what boards can do, better communications, better engagement. I'd love to hear, Jeanne, your views on data and also digitization, Malin, in terms of transparency, how to promote that. So what does that mean for boards? How do they respond? I mean, any other additional views besides communications, engagement, or on the back of what Adelena was saying? What are your thoughts on what are the implications of boards to solve this trust gap and to face the congestion issue that we have?
Oh, okay. I'll go first. Raring to go. If you're going to get me to talk about data, I can do it for like 3 days, 4 nights. So actually, I think I wanted to go back to the sort of original theme of exactly what you just mentioned or asked, which was, well, what does this mean for the boards? And yes, it means they're going to start to have to look at the data. But before that, there could be 4 things that I could think of that, really would be implications for them and things they could do, actually. So what are responses that they can have? And of course, first of all, is to push for more training and development in these areas. Because as I said, like even the E and the S and the G, actually yesterday I was like mapping out, like if it was a 101 from my board, like there's 10 sessions that I already know that they need to go on, which is just 101. And before they even talk about in depth, what are the really in-depth challenges when things are combined together. Secondly, I think it's also having the courage. So this goes back to what Nathan was saying. It's very true. Most board members, I think, they are trying their best to look after the interests of the company, and they're doing it the way they know how, right? And it is based a lot on historical experience and knowledge. But the world is changing at a pace that now what happened in the past is not necessarily going to be the same as what happens in the future. And that is the big uncertainty and unknown. So I think because of that, they have to be more willing to ask what they think may be stupid questions for a board member to ask, which is simply like, what does sustainability mean when you're talking about this? What are the potential range of E issues or S issues? Or, is there one we can, is one more material than the other? So this goes to Adelena's point, because it's so broad. Well, what should we be focusing on, right? So I think it's really asking that what you may think is stupid, but it's not, because nobody really has the same answer. I'm not saying nobody has an answer, but everybody might have a different answer. Third thing is they also need to, I believe, advocate and push for the employment of more appropriately experienced professionals within the company to be doing and managing those areas. I think in the past, and again, this is sort of part of historical trend, was we all kind of evolve from one trade to another, or we were predominantly an engineer, or I was a scientist, and then later on I moved into policy. But now, because of the level of detail and depth that is expected by everyone on the numbers and on the questions and answers that are required, you really need those experts to be in the company, right? Doing those jobs. And of course, I think the fourth point, which goes, Stacey, to that final point on data, they really do need to push for more transparency on operations. Yes, in the past, board members are not supposed to be, so involved in operations. That's management's job. But I'm sorry, I'm going to say, gone are the days of a board member expecting to be a helicopter parent to a company. That is no longer possible. And if you are going to be carrying out your fiduciary duty today, you really need to understand even how the operations work. So what are the processes? What are the controls? And it's all the way through the organization as well as across. I know across they've started looking at, all the business units, but now it's actually going down the depth. And I do think that is going to be a huge challenge.
Thank you, Jeanne. I'm going to get to a question from the audience, because this is very much around the ESG topic. And I just wanted to kind of stay there for a moment, because Adelena also mentioned there needs to be a mindset shift with ESG as an anchor. There's a question from Craig Hook. Thank you, Craig. Talking about, would it help for boards to consider sustainability / ESG as it is for a business, for rather than an ESG strategy, I guess a standalone strategy, or another subcommittee, or giving it to legal and risk consultants? Talk a little bit about an integrated framework where the roles and KPIs of the board, executive, and managers for a sustainable business can cascade down. And Craig was mentioning that should be considered. What do you all think about that? Jeanne, maybe staying with you. What do you think about that? That's board structure and
definitely. Look, I think when we all learn about a new topic, there is a learning curve, right? And this learning curve right now, everyone is still just talking about the topics in silo. They're also interpreting sustainability in a different way. So as a business, I think businesses started off interpreting it as growing trees, protecting the environment. Some were talking about community programs. Some have even decided it's philanthropy for some reason, but that's how they start. All right, everybody starts somewhere. And so, the question that was posed was obviously by someone who's already up the learning curve, because yes, a business that truly does understand what corporate sustainability or sustainability for an organization is that organization wants to operate forever. So if they're going to operate forever, it means they need to integrate both the risks and the opportunities for that organization, and looking at that as a whole for the medium and long-term business strategy, or long-term, basically it's a long-term continuity planning. So if, organizations were fast enough to move up the curve, that really is what they're supposed to be looking at. And these, E, S, and G areas are metrics. They're KPIs that, you know, are helpful for you to look at those areas.
Yeah, Mei-Lin, I mean, this is about KPIs, transparency. What do you think?
Yeah, so, you know, I am chair of the technical committee at the IEEE about sustainability. There's a bunch of measurements coming at all of you. And this whole thing about transparency, you ain't seen nothing yet. Today, you can do things in a company that other people don't know about. But now we're moving into a world which is like you're living life on TV and the whole world is seeing it. Organizations like Glassdoor are actually getting the inside report on who's a good boss, right? There's nowhere to hide. So these issues of sustainability, we need better metrics. And IEEE has about a couple dozen committees working on metrics. How do you measure stuff? In the past, it was hard to measure things, but you know, with Internet of Things, with sensing, with AI, you can measure almost anything. There is no way to hide. So boards have to consider, what if everyone could see everything that was happening in our company? Would that be okay? Because that time is coming.
Yeah, Chris, I see you have a comment as well.
Yeah,
everyone can see everything. Live TV. What do you think?
Well, it's terrifying, to be honest. But I just listen with great interest to a lot of what's just been said. I'll try and address the question. I think, and if all we're doing is delegating disclosure obligations to legal and risk compliance, then we're missing the wood for the trees. I think exactly what Jeanne said, Mei-Lin, you know, that this is a generational shift. It's very interesting what Adelena said. I wrote it down, you know, that there's just no more trust. And it might sound obvious, but it really hits home. If that's really the case, right? If it really, the greater public has lost trust in these companies, what does that mean for the traditional capitalist sort of system that developed in Western markets, particularly, I guess, United States and maybe Anglo-Saxon markets, UK? You know, is that dead? And I think if you're going to change these issues and address the problem, it's accepted it's a problem, you can get all the data you need, you can have all the requirements you want, you can force all the disclosure that you think is necessary. But if you're going to make a meaningful difference, and thinking about that from a board perspective, you need to change the people on the board, all right? Which is why we have the D word, the diversity word, okay? Our panel here is not sufficiently diverse, okay, because I'm the only male on this panel. But I'm the oldest one, probably. Anyway, but you know, you need younger people, all right? You need people who understand technology, right? The Internet of Things and artificial intelligence and machine learning. You need people from different cultures, different sexes. People think diversity and they just think, oh, it's gender. It's not. And that's what you need to do. Now, in some cases, that's turkeys voting for Christmas, right? Because, you know, you've got all these octogenarians sitting on some of these boards, or old, you know, white males like me sitting on boards of companies. And they're trying to react to something they don't understand, to Mei-Lin's point, all right? This wave of technology change that's coming. And to Adelena's point about, you know, this distrust, if that's the case, then I think you need to think more fundamentally and take a very hard look at board structure.
Yeah. Now, Jeanne, before I get to you, I actually want to hear Adelena's view in response to this. The importance is to change the people on the board. We have issues of overboarding. We have issues of board tenure. I know we have different regions with different kind of jurisdictions here, but I mean, what do you think about that phenomenon very quickly? I mean, in terms of the board members, what's going on there and how can that be changed or improved on?
Well, I think that I agree with Chris. You know, I think the Chris point about diversity is really crucial, right? It's not just gender. I have to emphasize that it has to be competency, right? So we do require a variety of women with competent skills in technology, for example, women in competency skills, right? In sustainability, in people, especially. It's a huge lack of competent people, whether it's, specific in dealing with people's skills, on human resources, for example, on the boards, for instance, right? These are essential things that we require on a board. Having said that, I have to say that for every board member, especially if it's a public listed company board, and SME boards for that matter as well, to assist the progress and growth, right? And in a lot of cases today, we're even talking about turning around the company in order for it to even survive and sustain, for the next 100 years. Having the right kind of skill sets, every single board member, I believe, it's important for them to even understand data analytics, for instance, right? What those numbers mean, where technology is going, even them understanding how to use technology and how technology changes their own lives, starting from there, for example. I mean, over the COVID period, you could see a lot of board members, whether it's chairmen or, directors who are very used to having secretaries to do a lot of things for them, next to them, struggle, in the lockdowns, in their own homes, trying to get onto a Zoom meeting, for example, and things like that. So I think we cannot run away from it. We need to be, always upgrading ourselves, studying whatever it is new, being open to the fact that once you're a board member, that's not the pinnacle of your career. It's not the end of it, and it's not the end of learning. As a board member, it's a lifelong learning, right? And that's a necessity. And I think that, one of the key things to be abreast of really what your consumers are wanting, being in touch with that, right? I mean, Jeanne talked about, also understanding your operations and things like that, internal controls, which is what, a lot of regulators, security commissions around the world, are very focused on in terms of having this risk being addressed. And risk is talking about internal controls and operations, whether it's top down, sideways, every way. That's we are so focused on risk. But I have to say that, there is having seen and researched as well, over the course of Asia Pacific, actually, a lot of businesses and a lot of boards are moving in the past, it's been very much about helping management to contain risk or prevent, undue risk. But actually now it's more going towards taking more risk. And I think that's important because, technology, like what Maddie said, it's actually taking the risk, right, of investing in technology. It's taking a risk, So there's a shift. It's slow, but there's a shift that is a uptake, in taking those risks. I think that's important. It's also important for people to acknowledge and understand that as well. And therein it goes back to my point of communication, right? Because a lot of times the stakeholders are not aware that there are actually some changes that are already happening on the board in terms of how they look at things, in terms of what they are garnering for. And, it takes time for businesses and huge structures to shift, right? And you're talking about a huge elephant, right? It's not going to be running like a cheetah, tomorrow overnight. That's not going to happen, right? And with people, it takes time for people to also shift in the way they think, in the way they feel about things. And then that's going to change their behaviors, how they actually do make decisions and take the next steps forward. There is a positive growth perspective for that, I think, and coupled also with what the security commissions are putting forward, I think in terms of having the institutional investors take a stand on ESG. I think that's a huge change. They're wanting institutional investors to take a firm stand, and be vocal about corporate practices, raising governance issues, things around disclosures, because institutional investors have got their engagement. But what Security Commission, for example, in Malaysia, is moving forward, into having even the fact that, hey, we want that to be disclosed as well. We want the disclosures of your engagement, right? Yeah, so there's a move.
That's interesting, yeah.
That's a move, right?
Yeah.
And like, for example, I mean, having said a lot of the points about, corporate practices and governances, for example, even in Malaysia, although we had a huge push even last year, right, in our budget, there was, a very clear indication by the finance minister to say, well, every public listed company has got to have at least one woman director on board. Yeah. But even today, now we've got like a year ahead, it's only maybe about 20%. Yeah, that has got a compliance, to that. Okay.
Yeah.
So there is a lag in terms of gaining that momentum. It is moving. It is just not as fast as maybe everybody wants it to be. But the good thing is that it is moving. I think that's the key point about that. Now,
There's
the second
momentum.
thing, the second thing also about where the Security Commission, like for example in Malaysia, is garnering for, aside from the institutional investors having to be more firm, right, with a governance issue, is we talked about the long-serving independent directors, for example, right? So for Malaysia, for instance, although this was put as a point across for the public sector companies, maybe, it's still sort of like it takes its time to go through the processes, right? So even today, we're still looking at, say, maybe 46% of public listed companies in Malaysia that still have long-serving independent directors that have been serving more than 9 years. So our cap is actually 9 years, right? They have that fresh change, that fresh perspective. It's not that they are not competent or they're not good. It's just the fact, like, what Chris has highlighted as well. You want fresh perspective. You want, and this is what Jeanne has also said, you want people with the right kind of skills and skill sets and experiences, to parlay, those sustainability issues forward, right? So I mean, there are points where corporate governance, I think there's always this point as well to consider, right? In Asia especially, you can see the trend that if it's not made a law, it is quite, and there's no enforcement, for that matter, then it is likely that it would not actually be taken that as considered as seriously as perhaps if it was truly made law, right? And I would say that, everything boils down to that at this point in time. And in Malaysia, when we talk about things like workplace, I think this is one of the issues that you also raised earlier, Stacey. How do we actually look at workplace? So in Malaysia, the Ministry of Women and Family Development have been very gung-ho in the last 1 year to really get the anti-sexual harassment bill out, right? And they've succeeded in that. It's gone through Parliament and it's already been gazetted, as a bill. This is huge because the reports, if you talk about statistics, and that's why sometimes I want to put this across, we can't make all decisions based on measurement and statistics, right? For example, in this case, there's a lot of people who actually suffer, sexual harassment at workplace, don't actually report it because of fear of loss of the job and everything else, or being more harassed, for that matter. So even though the statistics was already strong, they still push this forward because they recognize that many people don't come forward to report, right? And I think that's a key issue, right? If you talk about, it covers the SDGs on, decent work, it covers the SDGs on women diversity and so forth. And I think these are the kind of things that you want to consider, as part of incorporating the procedures, of anti-harassment per se, not just sexual harassment, because the other thing that we brought forward post the bill that has been issued is the fact that we have there's also the workplace harassment overall.
Big issue, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay.
Very big issue.
Yeah. So
yeah.
so these are some of the
yes.
latest acts. I think that's one of the things that you wanted to also address, during this time, at the dialogue. And so yes.
These are really important points, Adelena, and I think just the point about the role of regulations, and thank you for showcasing Malaysia as an example, the role of institutional investors, but also how companies need to take more calculated risks and not just fear the risks, but look at opportunities around board tenure, around diversity, and also looking at some of these emerging issues around workplace harassment, sexual harassment, and other issues. Jeannie, I know you had a point, and then to Mei-Lin, and then we have a question from the audience. So Jeannie, go ahead. I know you had your hand up.
Yeah, sure. Actually, just very short. I think after Adelena probably already said that, there is one point definitely, which is I think we need to be very clear on when we say diversity, what do we mean? Diversity of competency and experience. I think it's not about how someone looks or necessarily age. Like, I think sometimes we focus too much on that. I think actually it is, really the diversity of knowledge so that we know we've covered everything. So the second point I wanted to kind of also supplement what Adelena had said is I agree. I think boards need to, well, first of all, the traditional way of looking at risk has been short-term. It's been quarterly, it's been annually, and that is the problem. That they have not actually looked at medium, longer term risks. How do they manage those? And how do those then fit in to now what should be an increasing focus, which is new business opportunities, right? The whole point is the business needs to change. And in order for you to continue to have revenue, you need to innovate and think of, well, what's the next business I'm going to do given these disruptions, given all of these uncertainties. And so she's absolutely right. On one hand, the focus on short-term risk is, it's a little bit passé because it is so siloed and it's really not enough. But in addition to medium and long-term, she's absolutely correct that the boards are now starting to realize, but in order to do these new businesses, you actually need a little bit of risk-taking. So the whole point is, therefore, is to actually take informed risk, right? It's not about just taking risks, but if you are informed on the risk that you are taking, that is very different. So doing all the scenario analysis, for example, that actually helps the board members to think through, right? What could be the possible scenarios and the pros and cons of everything. So I think that's something that I totally agree with Adelena on. And I think, we're seeing it. I think the last point I wanted to make, and it starts to touch on the question that was made, different places, different priorities. And I think this is that big, double, triple, quadruple whammy of like everything that is like all in the air is actually, even in different markets and different places, things are very different, right? So this point, the question that was made just now, the EQ of the board, especially and in Asia, because most boards are predominantly family kind of owned, and therefore it's all, friends, family, or, like-minded people. How do you change that? And that is truly very different from anywhere else, in other places, like in Australia or, in the US. So we have a different set of challenges here. And I like to just, last point on this is I have hope, because I do think the third generation of these families, I think they start to see the difference and they're part of that younger generation. I hope they can see the points that, Adelena was making, that, there needs to be diversity of competency experiences. And I think that's starting to happen. And in fact, one of the clients that I have, he's doing that, right? He's doing that really well at New World. So, yeah.
Thank you, Jeannie. Mei-Lin.
Yeah, there's something that's going on here in Silicon Valley in California that I just thought might be helpful to share with boards in Asia Pacific. There's this idea of reverse mentorship. So you don't bring necessarily the young people or the women on the board if there's obstacles to that in fact board members would have a reverse mentor So 40-year-old board members would have 20-year-old reverse mentors. 60-year-old board members would have 30-year-old board mentors. There are ways to address this. And the first statistic that I gave at the beginning was that digitization is changing because of customer expectations, rising customer expectations. When boards are not tuned to those rising customer expectations, that's the biggest danger. It's the unknown unknowns that will trap the board. So how does the board keep track of the things they don't know, the unknown risks? They have to reach out beyond their comfort circle. They have to reach out to the customers that they want to have and talk to them and find out, what are your expectations? What do you want to buy next? What is not working about our products for you? These are questions that the board has to grapple with in order to take the risks. They don't know that by not taking what they call risks, that taking the company into a bigger danger.
Yeah, a lot of board members and C-suite are struggling with that echo chamber effect, or black box. They have the unknown unknowns, Malin, as you mentioned. And as we talked about, there are many areas and boxes of unknown unknowns today. Now, I just wanted to turn to a point about, Jeanne, you were saying that let's be optimistic. Let's look at solutions here. We know there are a lot of challenges, but a big part of that is around training, around reskilling, around bringing in that diversity of background and thought. How can boards today better equip themselves then to build more competency, resilience, and that change management mindset? How can they do that? And we have 5 minutes left, so let's keep this really short. So I think earlier on, per person. Very
okay. I mean, earlier on, I'd already mentioned sort of 4 things, but I think the one that, every board can start off with is, what is the program for the board members to take in order to be more competent in all the ESG areas, right? So I think, that needs to be number one, because, it's hard to ask the right questions when you ask, or you may be wasting time asking those questions during meetings, right? So, I think it'd be best if board members actually did have a development program and be transparent about it. I think companies need to also report on, hey, my board is now being educated on this and they're being informed so that by the time they, by the time they get to the meeting, they're making decisions, right? I think that's important.
Very good. Adelena, 1 point, super short. What will be your 1 point training idea?
I second what Jeanne has said, because, I think that doing your homework before you come for a meeting is really important. Whatever that you need to understand, you need to do that. But I think what's also very important is the presence of mind, right?
Yes.
So yes, a lot of times, even the Institute of Corporate Governance talks about all the technical skills, digital skills, and so forth. But what we truly really need is the presence of mind, the optimism, the positive future thinking, curiosity, right? So this is where I think the engaging of yourself, your self-awareness is really important as a board member today, more important than it has ever been before. And that will actually propel us to be able to make better decisions, more forward thinking.
Self-awareness. Chris, 1 point. What do you think?
Well, I think training has a role to play clearly, but I would say that more important is to get the right board structure. You've got to start with the right people. Because if they're not the right people, it's not the right skill sets on the board, no amount of training is going to change the culture of the firm.
Great point. Infused with new people, new ideas. Malin.
ABC, activity-based accounting, costing is essential.
Yeah.
We cannot make decisions in a service economy without knowing how the cost of our services. The other thing is climate accounting. If I have one word for boards, pay attention to the new accounting approaches that will help guide your company through these storms.
Yeah, and it's changing very quickly. So I wanted to thank all of you, very, very esteemed and really well-respected speakers here showcasing what can boards do around corporate governance. I think the audience really benefited from your insights. I thank the audience as well for your questions and your participation. I'm going to do the very difficult job of summarizing our very enriching discussion just now into some key bullet points, because I think there was so much shared just now. But you know, just in summary, number one, there are waves of issues that are hitting boards, from technology and digital adoption to ESG to geopolitical issues to supply chain, stakeholder capitalism to employee engagement. That requires a mindset shift for boards and to really have ESG as an anchored strategy. But along with that, know that companies are now live on TV with all your stories broadcasting live, and there is a trust gap. So that's important for communications and engagement. There's an important role for people, specialized hires for people who actually know what they're doing. Board to really change the board with fresh ideas, make sure there's board diversity, board independence, the role of data for transparency, for metrics, be aware of the new accounting standards, the importance of change management, and this is about long-term continuity planning, and that we need to help companies take calculated risks, not only look at risks, but really embrace the opportunities of taking those risks, and to really understand the unknown unknowns, reach out to stakeholders to gauge expectations, really have a very good look of what is the world looking like around you, but be mindful that different regions have different contexts, so tailor your solutions accordingly. So thank you, everyone. We're ending right on time. I wanted to thank the speakers once again, and thank you to Pacific Basin Economic Council for hosting such a meaningful dialogue. And on to the next session on ESG. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stacey, for wonderful moderation.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.